the Baen Free Radio Hour.
On the podcast, broken mirrors reform, and 7 years bad luck runs backwards in a radiating pattern from a warehouse in Bentonsport, Iowa, as Improbability Drive invents itself from 20 spilled wingnuts, a stray kitten, and mixing a barrel of Maid-Rites with a bushel of Scotcheroos. Plus, we continue with the complete audiobook serialization of Son of the Black Sword by Larry Correia. All right now. Welcome to the Baen Free Radio Hour podcast. It's an honor to have you along. I'm Baen Senior Editor Tony Daniel. This time we have part two of a two-part interview. Mike Massa talking about the new book he's written with John Ringo. This is a continuation of the Black Tide Rising science-based zombie series, and it takes place near the beginning of John's solo series opener, Under a Graveyard Sky. That's the very beginning of the zombie plague as it begins to affect the east coast of the U.S. in particular. This book is called The Valley of Shadows, and Mike will tell us a lot more about it in a moment. Plus, we continue with the complete audiobook serialization of Larry Correia's great high fantasy novel, Son of the Black Sword. Now here's the news. The trees may be bare in November, but we have some pretty nice leaves of paper to brighten up your autumn, since the Baen November trade paperback and mass market paperback are at booksellers. Hey, first we have Hocus Pocus by Gordon R. Dickson and Paul Anderson. Hocus, friendly fuzzy aliens resembling teddy bears with very vivid imaginations. They also have a hard time distinguishing between human fact and fiction, or in this case, the present from the past. So when a Hoka thinks he's Napoleon Bonaparte, you'd better believe it, especially since it may be your best chance for survival on a hostile alien world. And now out in mass market is The Spark by David Drake. In the time of the ancients, the universe was united, but that was far in the past. Now only broken artifacts remain. A few humans, known as makers, can reshape these into their original uses, but chaos rules. Now Pal, a youth from the sticks, has come to the capital. He's about to learn how far he has to go and what he must sacrifice to become a true champion. And don't forget, in January, the sequel to The Spark is coming out. That's called The Storm, so you can get the spark and get ready for the storm that's brewing soon. Hocus Pocus by Gordon R. Dickson and Paul Anderson, and The Spark by David Drake are now out at booksellers everywhere. This is part two of an interview with Mike Massa talking about The Valley of Shadows. Part one is available on last week's podcast. Want to welcome Mike Massa to the podcast. Hello, Mike.
Hi, Tony. How you doing this evening?
Pretty good. Mike Massa has lived a diverse and adventurous life, including stints as a Navy SEAL officer.
Hoo-yah. Yep. No, I'm sorry. I was just giving the traditional SEAL greeting, which is hoo-yah.
Oh, I see. I see. An international investment banker. Do they have a call?
Yes, it's called Show Me the Money.
I see. And an internet technologist. Mike is currently at a university university cybersecurity researcher, consulted by governments, Fortune 500 companies, and high net worth families on issues of privacy, resilience, and disaster recovery. He has lived outside the U.S. for several years, plus military deployments, and has traveled to over 80 countries. He's the author of a bunch of short stories, and now with John Ringo, the co-author of The Valley of Shadows, a new entry in the Black Tide Rising series. You've got Matt Riccardi, who has an interesting. Why did you think that the mob was a natural or a reasonable thing to call in here? You mentioned something about that they run a sort of barter economy.
They do. They very much do. I didn't want to aggravate any actual existing, shall we say, entrepreneurial organization, so I made one out of whole cloth. My grandparents immigrated from Italy in the 1920s, and so I have a very strong ethnic Italian-American family. I mean, we identify as Americans first, but we're very proud of our contacts in the old country. And if you grow up in a culturally Italian-American neighborhood, like I did, as a fishing neighborhood, you become aware, just sort of by living there, of how things operate. And I won't say it was Goodfellas level of shenanigans, but there's definitely shenanigans. And there's definitely a gray economy that these cultural enclaves operate within. And I naturally sort of extended that and created this character, Frank Montecardi. I think it's a terrific name that corresponds well with some of the well-known Italian mobsters of the Prohibition era that were running. Now those families are very upright and proud. But back in the day, running Canadian whiskey across the Great Lakes region and down the East Coast was pretty illegal. And the famous mob bosses of yore were morally flexible because they wanted to make a buck. And so Frank Montecardi, he wants to make a buck. And one of the ways he makes a buck that brings him into contact with Smith is through illegally caught and distributed seafood, which is in the real world, a multi-billion-dollar business every year. I think on the order of $3 or $4 billion a year in illegally caught wild seafood, and distributing that into places where it's in high demand doesn't happen through normal channels. And so he has this sort of barter gray economy. So if you want to source, the ingredients for your vaccine and the vaccine itself, guys like Montecardi are pretty helpful. But they're not the natural allies of people like Joanna and the cops.
Yeah. Well, I can't remember exactly, but in a way, Tom brings them together because he needs them.
He does. He figures out. So in Under Graveyard Sky, I don't think we're going to be spoiling anything. The main characters figure out that the only way to make a stopgap vaccine is a live attenuated vaccine, which means you need to have a source of live virus. And where does live virus exist? Well, it exists in infected people. So for most of the readership of this novel initially will be people who've read one or more of those books. That's going to be old news. But there's no way that any one organization can, on an industrial scale, manufacture enough vaccine to tide civilization, the centers of civilization, over until Big Pharma can catch up, because they're doing so, they're, not to put a fine point on it, but they're harvesting infected humans. And even though they've lost their minds and it's not reversible, as both Steve Smith's character and Tom Smith's character say, whenever they kill a zombie, they're fully cognizant. They're killing a human being, and it bothers them a lot. But it's the only way through. The only way out of the crisis is through, and that's what they do. But you can't scale if you don't have someone like a Montecardi and their organization that can pull in hundreds or thousands, not hundreds of thousands, but hundreds or perhaps thousands of people in their extended economic network that is not the official economy to begin ginning up these activities. And so that's why Frank's part of it. Joanna's part of it because she has her fingers everywhere in the city in terms of disaster relief, business continuity, and crisis management. That's the function of her multi-thousand-person office. And, of course, the cops' role is self-explanatory. They're law and order. They're on the streets everywhere. And, of course, the banks have the financial angle. And they can underwrite this because the money to do this isn't going to come out of the city. They're not going to directly, no mayor would directly fund the wholesale murder of infected people. So how do you do that? And that's with this cartel.
Well, you have some pretty gruesome. It looks like you did a lot of research on how one would take a spinal cord out of a freshly killed person.
Actually, I consulted with a couple of surgeons. I consulted with a couple of butchers. I've actually, I'm a hunter, so I've harvested a few deer and an elk, and I know just how messy it gets. And then I tried to imagine doing that on a wholesale basis, and I'm like, oh my God, that'd be horrible. And one of the ways you deal with things that are really horrible is you introduce sort of this dark gallows humor, and a lot of my characters do that. It's a very human reaction to almost intolerable situations. Is you use joking, pretty awful joking, as an emotional defense, and my characters definitely do that.
Yeah, because the spinal cord like breaks off, and it's connected to all this other gunk.
Yes, it is. You have to you have to do it very carefully. You can't hurry through it. And of course, this is highly infectious material, so you're wearing a cumbersome set of exposure gear and a respirator. You're handling very sharp instruments. You don't want to spoil. It's hard enough to collect the dang material in the first place. You don't want to spoil it, and so it's kind of dicey. In fact, one of the interesting characters that John and I created for this book that works for the mobster, for Frank Montecardi, comes up with the idea of how do we find people who already have some of the skills to we'll call it process the harvest in an industrial scale, and they're not going to lose their minds doing it, because the average person isn't capable of doing that. And so we meet a new character who's persistent in the first book and in the second book, and she's a real character. She's we'll call her a Slavic entertainer who we are introduced to as the girlfriend of the gangster Moll, if you will, of Frank Montecardi. And she ends up being a lot more than just ornamental. She has a real core of steel at the center of her.
Yeah, and there's some viewpoints. We're talking about old Risky.
Risky.
And you do some nice viewpoints from her, and we come to really like her. She's a winning character. She has an interest, and correct me if I'm wrong, but she seems to be connected to the Kildare universe.
I wouldn't know about that. I wouldn't know the first thing about that.
Okay. But she's really cool, and she's sort of the moral conscience of this mobster, right? In a strange way.
She tries to be. She was someone who was a victim of human trafficking, and multiple times, and was snatched from progressively worse and worse situations until the people at the end of the supply chain tried to market her to Montecardi. Now, the thing about Montecardi is he has limits. There's some things he just will not do. There's some things he will not abide. Like a Tony Soprano. I know I'm not a good guy, and I know I do a lot of bad stuff, but I got my limits. You see? And one of the things we don't do, we don't mess with women. We don't mess with kids. It's hard. You work for me. You do that, I put you in the ground. So when someone tries to sell Risky to him, he takes that really personally, and they form a relationship on the basis of that. That then turns into more of a partner relationship than just someone that's ornamental and available other ways as well. And she has, because of what's happened to her, she knows what happens. She intrinsically understands what it's like when law and order breaks down, when civilization goes away. And because she knows better than most how bad it can get, she's also more likely to make the jump when things begin to go horribly awry and encourage others to do the same. And so that puts her sort of in opposition to Tom Smith, who's, he's Mr. I'm going to do whatever it takes. We're going to last as long as we have to. We're going to see it through. We took the money. This is our job. And she's like, hey, pal, at some point, you got to look out for what's really at stake here. And it's more than just money. It's more than just the bank. And that's going to be that's a theme that I hope resonates with the audience. But those two are not initially aligned. And she's a really interesting character. We'll see where that goes.
Yeah. So as conditions deteriorate, and I mean, those who have read the series know things are not going to get better, and until they get much worse. So, what is Tom's response, and how is he holding up mentally and emotionally going into the real hard times?
Tom is a little more complex than the hearty sort of strong, resilient exterior would suggest. He's already shown that he's prepared to bend the rules and take some personal risk to take care of family. When he first, early in the book, breaks the rules and leaks this information, putting himself and the bank, frankly, at substantial legal risk. And if the emergency hadn't been so dire, that would have had tremendous consequences for him personally. But by and large, he lives up to his own interpretation of this pledge to serve the bank, to serve the economy, to serve the greater good, if you will, because he pledged his word. And as things get progressively worse, he's going to be struggling to keep this coalition together, because he really believes, he's a true believer. If we wait just long enough, maybe just long enough, we'll turn the corner. We'll be able to mass produce this stuff without this terrible harvesting thing that we're doing now, and we can literally save the world. That's what he's thinking of. He's thinking big, but to him, saving the world means we have to keep the economy moving. If you manage to save a lot of people, but there's no infrastructure to grow crops, distribute food, make fuel, fix cars, have hospitals, then you've lost. You have to keep the infrastructure. And he's really maybe over-focused on that. And, he I don't want to give too much away, but he will come to a point where he has to evaluate, like everybody else, is it time to jump? And then he has to persuade his boss, hey, it's time to jump. And that's even harder. It's really hard to separate a banker from their money. It's even harder to get the banker out of a market. So that's something that the bankers struggle with in both real life and in this book.
Yeah, there's a lot of, the metaphor of the Roman soldier taking salt, you come back to again and again. It's something that means a lot to Tom. If you take the salt, you owe your loyalty.
Yeah, exactly. It's whether things go well or they don't go well, you stick with it, and that's a real world dynamic that many veterans, especially when they're fresh out of the military, struggle with, because that they're applying this rubric, this rule of thumb. Hey, I said yes, I took the money, I'm going to do what I said. And that's not something that is nearly as common in, say, an all-civilian traditional workforce. And it's one of the things that veterans have to find a way to adjust as they settle into their, I'll call it their corporate lives. But it's a very real phenomenon. And I was very comfortable including that, because it's based on both personal experience, both my own experience, and observing, without exaggeration, scores of other veterans firsthand struggling with that as well. Most especially from the special ops community, where the sense of team and group identity is so profound, because it's a survival mechanism for special operators. And the SEALs like to say, there is no I in SEAL team. Although, of course, nowadays the SEALs say, plenty of I's in movie contracts, isn't there? So the notion that once I've given my word isn't just tied to honor, it's also tied to this sense of, if we don't work together, things are going to go horribly pear-shaped. And that's something that Tom feels innately.
Yeah. I imagine it's hard for veterans. I'm not a veteran. But I've also felt the same thing, just from being a Southerner, maybe. I don't know what the hell. Just you start a job, but it's time to move on, and it's hard to go to another employer. It's like because it's like you're being committed to a country in a way.
Yeah, it's a sense of identity as well. Those things all play together. They all reinforce each other. And our characters, the veterans, Tom in particular, really feel that keenly. And there's some characters that serve as foils for Tom's emotion, and they try and discuss this with him. Among them, as I've noted before, is Risky.
So, Mike, a lot of readers are going to be wondering about your background. We talked a little bit about it before, but I find it very interesting in how it applies to your writing as well, and how you became a writer from this military background. Now, you told us that you had grown up in a military family, if I'm not mistaken, right?
That's right. My father enlisted in World War II. He entered something called the Flying Midshipman Program and became a piston-engine fighter pilot. His first airplane, operational aircraft, after the training command was the F-8F Bearcat. And after World War II, there was a large-scale demobilization, and they simply didn't need the thousands of fighter pilots they had. So he was offered not really a dream job. He could stay in and fly a much less attractive aircraft, a big slow maritime patrol aircraft, or get out. So he chose to stay in, and he transitioned to something called a PB-4Y2, a modified B-24 Liberator bomber used for maritime surveillance and patrol, and then upgraded to the first purpose-built aircraft for that use, which was the P-2V-2 Neptune. And right after the Cuban Missile Crisis, he was sent to test pilot school and transitioned yet again to helicopters. And that's where, with the helicopter background, he did three things. He flew anti-submarine warfare patrols. He flew in three efforts to successfully recover space capsules, one from each of the Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo programs, and also flew search and rescue off Yankee Station in Vietnam. But when he finished his flying years, and he was a Navy captain, he was sent as the senior defense attaché to Argentina. And that's where, about the time, my mom and dad were very strong, staunch, traditional Catholics, and so there was a noticeable gap between their first tranche of 4 children in 5 years and then nearly a decade in a long wander of the youngest Massa, which is myself. And so about the time that Dad was a very senior officer, I was growing up in Argentina, and he had a double tour in Argentina, in part because this was the Peronista years when General Perón and Evita Perón ran the country, and it was a rather tense time in South America at that point. And so I grew up speaking Spanish, and then we relocated back to the States. And so I began with a very different look at a very different culture, and then we moved back to Louisiana, to New Orleans, which is yet another very different sort of culture from what I'll characterize either of the American coasts or Midwest America. And then ended up going to school in California, getting my degree at UCLA. And again, yet another very distinct culture from where I'd grown up. So I've become sort of this person that I feel like I come from everywhere. I don't feel like I have a birth city. We moved so much. And when I became an officer myself, and I went to school and got commissioned and went into the SEAL program, you typically move around a great deal between training at home and training overseas and then deploying overseas. You're very much on the move everywhere you go, which is how I came to have traveled to so many different countries. And then having gotten out, I went into technology consulting, and I ended up living in places as diverse as Germany and China in the late 90s and early noughts before I ended up finding myself in banking. And, of course, that took me back to Europe and to the Middle East, Africa, and throughout the Americas, and lived in a bunch of cities. So I feel myself be very fortunate to have seen so much of the world and sampled so many cultures, and that definitely informs my writing very, very much. And, of course, in this book in particular, we have a setting, New York, an industry, the financial services industry, and characters with backgrounds, I won't say entirely like my own, but certainly within shouting distance. And that definitely informed some of what I think are the more authentic details that I included for the sharp-eyed reader. That reader will be rewarded by seeing things that actually are pretty darn accurate, and that's by design.
Yeah. Well, how old were you when you left Argentina?
I was 8 years old.
Wow, so yeah, you got a taste of it that you remember.
Well, I remember Argentina with great clarity, and I spoke fluent Spanish. My mom took advantage of the and I don't mean this in any at all pejorative way, but Mom had grown up very, very poor during the Depression, and then she was a young naval officer's wife in the 40s and 50s and 60s, which was not by any means a glamorous life or a well-funded life, and suddenly she's living as a diplomat's spouse in a country which was very much about aristocratic privilege and very much about almost a feudal society, the era of General Perón. And so part of the living arrangements in Argentina for senior officers and members of people that held senior diplomatic posts, it came with a very fancy house, and it came with a staff. And her staff included a chef, an assistant chef, 2 nannies, several guards, a couple gardeners, 2 or 3 drivers, and they all lived in the outbuildings of this estate where the Argentine government housed this particular diplomatic post, which is true for all of the posts from any country. So for the first time, Mom had help in the kitchen, had help around the house. And I learned how to speak 2 different languages, Guarani, which is a language of the indigenous Indians of Paraguay, that being the origin of my national origin of one of my nannies, and of course Spanish. But it's a very peculiar sort of aristocratic Spanish that only the Argentines really speak. It's as distinctive to the trained ear as the Castilian Spanish of that region.
Yeah, I married an Argentine in another life, and we're divorced now, but and I was down there a bit. So, yeah, they call it Castellano, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and it's very different from anything that you've heard elsewhere. Well, that's cool. And then they dumped your mom in Louisiana without a staff, right? After that.
Then she finds herself in the garden spot of New Orleans, Louisiana, in the mid '70s, and it's very much very different from the metropolitan aristocratic environment that she'd been enjoying to that point in Argentina. And of course, it's a very mild climate. There's no humidity. There's no bugs in New Orleans. Absolutely not. There's certainly no hurricanes. Cough, cough. Hurricane Camille, and yeah, it was definitely a culture shock. Welcome back to the United States. So for a young 8-year-old boy returning to the United States in the deep South with limited command of English, it was definitely a wake-up call for me.
Yeah. Well, we don't really speak that strange accent you have now, even in the South yet. So you've got a California accent, it seems. So all right, so you went to college. Did you always think you were going to go into the military? And how the heck did you decide you were going to be a SEAL? And how did it decide for you?
I very much idolized my father. He was a huge influence in my life. And he passed away 2 years ago, and that's why I've dedicated this book to my show. The dedication underneath that of from John to Cap Malong is from myself to Captain Meade Massa. And Father's service certainly influenced my selection of branch, the Navy. And initially I thought, well, maybe I'll be someone who's in submarines, because that's very Tom Clancy's Hunter Red October had come out. It made submarines look really interesting. For my apprentice tour, which is the first college-based sea tour that you do. It's basically a summer. It can be anywhere from a 2-week period to the entire summer. And I was deployed. I was sent to as a very junior member of the crew, a midshipman, 3rd class Massa, was sent to USS Von Steuben, SSBN 632 Blue Crew, and we actually did a very unusual patrol in that we did a nuclear deterrence patrol, which is with a submarine exits the port and goes and hides somewhere in the ocean and listens very carefully for the message of Armageddon, which, thank God, in so many years has never come. But then we returned to port, and we offloaded 2 missiles and took on 2 new birds, and I was actually on board when they fired those missiles for practice at Kwajalein Atoll. Something, ironically, 35 years later, it partially informs a detail that I put into the second novel with John called River of Night, scheduled for next summer. And but that tour, being in that submarine for 61 days consecutively submerged at one stretch, really opened my eyes. And I said to myself, submarines are not for you. What are we going to do next? So I had a chance the next summer to spend time with the aviation community, and I had a chance to hop on a turkey. It's a NF-14 Tomcat, and I flew in the back seat for a couple hours and did some fun stuff. And then I flew in a TA-4J, and that was fun. And then I discovered that my eyes had just the teeny tiniest flaw, so I couldn't be a pilot. So that was right out. And that left ships. My third summer for my apprentice cruise, midshipman first class Massa, went on board USS Whidbey Island, was it? LSD-42. And gosh, I discovered that being a surface warfare officer was not going to be for me. I said, that's submarines no, aviation no, ships no. What's left? There was this thing called SEAL. I'm like, well, they work out a lot. They're on the beach. Okay, I'll give that a try. And I'm speaking somewhat tongue-in-cheek. I knew a bit more than that about the program. And it actually provided, I was aware of the attrition. And perversely, the very fact of the very high attrition was attractive to me because I wanted to accomplish something where statistically the odds were against me. And in the event of success, it would be due to my will and my will alone. And that's a very common thread amongst people who've been attracted to buds. That challenge is very seductive in a certain kind of way. And so I applied and competed and was selected for a spot to go to the buds, and eventually graduated after one particularly significant injury that I had to go have an operation and do a few other bits and pieces to get myself back in shape, and then eventually restarted and finished that time, and then went to the teams. And 8 years later, got out after having completed several deployments, both as an assistant officer in charge and later as an officer in charge of a SEAL platoon and a task unit commander, which is where you have more than a SEAL platoon or more than one operating element assigned to you when you're deployed and downrange, in this case in the Middle East. And I got out and began my civilian career. And a lot of the things that I learned as a SEAL, technically, obviously, would not apply. But special warfare operators, in part, are selected for their native curiosity and an ability to soak up new information, to swat up a new discipline rapidly. And that very much applied in my civilian transition, and in fact has been a part of my life since then, looking for a new challenge, identifying and soaking up a new technical discipline, and then striking out in that direction anew. And so being hopefully what will be a successful effort in becoming a science fiction and fantasy author will feature some of that same ability to learn rapidly, soak up a lot of new information, build new friendships and relationships, and successfully woo a reading fan base. So we'll see how that goes. Cross fingers.
Yeah, sure. And believe me, it's tough. And a lot of people wash out. Some with injuries to their brains.
I'm very, very fortunate to have been invited by Baen to co-write with John and to contribute not only to in John's universe, but to the universes in the intellectual property created by other Baen writers like Mike Williamson, like Chuck Gannon, like Tom Kratman, like Larry Correia.
Yeah, but you wouldn't. I mean, you got John pulled you out of. I mean, a lot of people wrote for, and some very good writers wrote for the Black Tide Rising series. But there, you have a real quality to your work. I mean, I was just joking. You got good chops, and I have no doubts you're gonna blaze a trail in science fiction. So what does? All right, your former SEAL. I guess you would call it retired. Not like you got kicked out. Kratman once got on to me about saying
I was honorably separated. I have an honorable discharge. I did not retire. I have 12 years total service, and that was several years short of a completed retirement.
That was the second part of an interview with Mike Massa talking about The Valley of Shadows. Part 1 is available on last week's podcast. Now we continue with the complete audiobook serialization of Son of the Black Sword by Larry Correia, Book 1 in the Saga of the Forgotten Warrior. After the War of the Gods, the demons were cast out and fell to the world. Mankind was nearly eradicated by the seemingly unstoppable beasts, until the gods sent the great hero Ram Rowan to save them. He united the tribes, gave them magic, and drove the demons into the sea. But as centuries passed, the descendants of the great hero grew in number and power. They became tyrannical and cruel, and their religion nothing but an excuse for greed. The people rose up, and the surviving royalty and their priests were made casteless, condemned to live as untouchables. The age of law had begun. Ashok Vidal has been chosen by a powerful ancient weapon to be its bearer. He is a protector, a member of an ancient military order of roving law enforcers. No one is more merciless in rooting out those who secretly practice the old ways as Ashok. But Ashok isn't who he thinks he is. And when he finds himself on the wrong side of the law, the consequences lead to rebellion, war, and perhaps transformation. Now here is the latest entry in Larry Correia's Son of the Black Sword.
"Who is it this time?" one of them asked. "A pair of havildars from the coast," a woman answered. The young man chuckled. "Has our house grown that desperate?" "What do you know of desperate? 60 of our best soldiers have tried and failed. 10 of our own caste have been carried from this hall cut or missing limbs." The woman sounded very angry, so the boy squished as far back into the corner as possible. Though he understood everything she said, her words were different than casteless speech, clear and not nearly so rough. These two were of the first caste. The angry woman continued. "We've been without our ancestor blade for nearly a month. The other houses are circling like vultures, and there are open discussions in the capital about our shame. If the sword does not choose soon, it will be seen as a sign of weakness." "My apologies, Mother, but a mere havildar? That's a nothing rank. Normally it would choose our greatest. For it to pick someone so low would be unseemly." "They are both young, but accomplished enough. Regardless, we are far beyond courtly matters now. The warrior caste is troubled. There are whispers that perhaps Angruvidal will not deem anyone worthy to wield it. If no one is chosen, then its magic will die. Other houses' ancestor blades have died before, usually from treachery or dishonor. But whatever the reason, those great houses have perished soon after their swords. Perhaps you should try to take Angruvidal up yourself, firstborn." "I'm not the soldier Father was." "Of course you're not Harter, and we'd hate for it to mark up that pretty face of yours. Now be silent. The warriors are here." He couldn't see, but he could still hear. He'd already watched the sword maim dozens of others, and he figured that this wouldn't be any different. The men in the robes announced the warriors by name, and their father's name, and their father's father. The boy still found that most curious. Casteless were not allowed to have a family name. Next, the announcer listed their offices and exploits. That part normally took far longer than the test itself, only these introductions were shorter than normal. It sounded as if these warriors hadn't dueled much or attended very many battles. Now the boy really wanted to see if the sword would treat them any differently from the proud ones it had already flayed. "My lady, you do us all a great honor by attending this event. I will take up Angruvidal and serve with distinction as your husband did before." "Proceed, Havildar," the angry woman in front of the tapestry commanded. A hushed silence fell over the main chamber. There were footsteps as the first man approached the sword. He must have been very brave because there was no hesitation, just the scraping of metal on stone as the sword was lifted. The boy could feel the tension. All of the observers were holding their breath. Could this be the one? Then the screaming began. Nope. The screaming abruptly stopped. The sword must have really disapproved of this warrior, because it had not taken long to make its decision. From the noise and the gasps of the crowd, it had been a particularly violent death. The woman of the first caste swore beneath her breath, but the boy was close enough that he was surprised to learn that even the highest of the high used the same profanity as the lowest of the low. "Next!" she snapped. This warrior sounded much younger and not nearly so cocky. "I will do my best, my lady." Luckily, the man in front of the alcove had stepped to the side, so the boy could peek out again. The first warrior had stabbed himself through the chest, and it looked like he'd done a messy job yanking it back out through his guts. This one was going to be at least a 5-bucket job. Sadly, he was bleeding out right on top of the palest stone in the entire floor. The boy would be scrubbing until his hands were raw tonight. The second warrior was standing by the sword, looking flushed and timid. As usual, the dying man had flung the sword clear across the chamber. Maybe that was why the witnesses tried to stand so far away, so as to not be sliced by accident, as a disemboweled warrior flailed about. Despite just ripping a man in half, the gleaming black sword was clean. Wearing an expression like he was about to pet a cobra, he knelt down and extended one hand, but hesitated. "Do it!" the lady of the house ordered. He did. The warrior slowly lifted the sword from the floor. He grimaced when the handle bit into his hand. The boy didn't know why the sword did that. Maybe it wanted to taste them first. He stood up straight, held the sword pointed at nothing, and waited for its decision. This one had an honest face, so the boy hoped that the sword wouldn't be too hard on him. Several seconds passed. The crowd was growing hopeful. They began to whisper excitedly. But the boy could already tell this wasn't right. The man was concentrating so hard that he was red-faced and sweating. Veins were standing out in his forehead and neck. This warrior was the strongest one yet, and he was most certainly a good man, but he wasn't the right man. Then it was as if the warrior's limbs moved on their own. The muscles in his arm twitched and contracted. The dark blade flashed, and he gasped as it parted his flesh. The sword clattered back to the stone at his feet. He stepped back, one hand pressed to the long, weeping cut on his other arm. It wasn't even deep enough to sever any tendons. It had only cut him enough to teach him a lesson. The sword must have really liked this particular warrior. "Forgive me," the young man said through gritted teeth. "I was found wanting." "What did you see?" the woman demanded. "So much." It was as if he didn't know how to put it into words. "It was as if the eyes of every warrior who has carried this blade before were upon me. There's 1,000 years of courage stored within, waiting for something." The warrior stumbled, then fell over on his backside. The men in uniform went to him to staunch the bleeding. "I'm sorry, my lady. I'm becoming a bit faint." "Get out," she snapped. "All of you, be gone from my house. Come back when you have someone worth a damn." The boy was glad the sword hadn't chosen yet, because when it finally did, he'd have to give up his comfy job of blood scrubber. It would be dawn soon. He'd spent the entire night cleaning the pale stones. He'd scrubbed until his fingers had grown soft and his calluses had begun peeling off. He had to be careful not to add his own blood to the mess, so he'd torn scraps from the bottom of his shirt and wrapped his fingers so he could continue. Up and down the stairs, he'd carried that bucket so many times. Down red, up clean, over and over, until he was satisfied that the main chamber was perfect. The house slaves told him that this big room was normally only used for parties, where members of the first caste and the highest-ranking warriors and richest workers would gather to dance and eat more meat than the entire casteless quarter would consume in a season. He suspected they were teasing him. The boy had not seen the other casteless since they'd taken the warrior's body to the furnace. There were guards patrolling inside the great house, but they didn't pay any attention to him. He'd be inspected by the overseer when he was dismissed to make sure he hadn't stolen anything. It was just the boy and the sword in the main chamber, so there was no one to punish him for speaking. He had been alone with the sword so many times over the last few weeks that it had become his only friend. "Why did you spare the last warrior?" the boy asked the sword as he inspected the seams for any errant spatter. Of course, the sword did not answer. The only time it made any sound was when it was whistling through the air or hacking through bone. "Why do you only hurt some, but kill others?" "I think it is because you like them better. The whole men think they know you, but I don't think they do." The sword lay there, as long as he was tall, and made out of some dark metal that he'd never seen before. The boy walked around it carefully. "You don't have ears, so you probably can't hear me. But Mother says I talk just to hear myself anyway." "You don't have a mouth to talk, but you still let everybody know what you think." It was hard to find tiny specks of blood by lantern light alone, and a few times he found himself picking at something that was actually a brown spot on the rock itself. Even though he'd practically memorized every single stone set in the floor, he scrubbed at them just in case. "I probably shouldn't talk to you because I'm not a real person. But you're not a person either. I don't know what the law says about that." Then he noticed a fat drop of blood that he'd somehow missed, but only because it was beneath the sword. The boy was suddenly very afraid. That had never happened before. "I mop around you every night, but I can't mop under you," the boy said. "I could slosh some water on you." The tools the older casteless were issued sometimes rusted. Could this sword rust? If the whole men would have him severely beaten for missing a drop of blood, they'd surely murder him for making their magic sword rust. Very carefully, he reached for the drop with his rag-wrapped fingertips. He didn't know what the parts of the sword were called, but the part that protected the fingers was resting on the floor, and lifted up the part the warriors tried to handle. If he was careful, he could sneak under that without touching anything. He bumped it with one shaking knuckle. "I mean no disrespect." The sword didn't answer, but since it didn't remove his fingers, it didn't seem to mind. He wiped away the blood with a fingertip, but there was still a stain there on the stone. If he let it sit, it would become a permanent blemish on House Vidal, and he'd be beaten to death for it. There had to be a way to move the sword without offending it. They'd put it here somehow, after the Thakur had died after all. But he was not a trained warrior. He was a child of the non-people. He didn't know any other way. "Forgive me, sword, but I have to fulfill my duty." The boy looked at the filthy rags wrapped around his hands. That would not do. It would be wrong to touch the sword with something dirty. So he unwound them until it was just raw, clean skin. Then he took a deep breath, reached out, and took hold of the handle. It was far lighter than it looked. The sword bit into his palm. The guards found him some time later, lying on the floor, barely conscious, and raised the alarm. Weak, confused. It was like waking up from a bad nightmare. And when the boy realized he was still holding onto the sword, he began to panic. "I'm sorry." Hot tears began to stream down his cheeks. "Please don't kill me." But the intimidating guard seemed more terrified by this development than he was. Most of them seemed too stunned to react, and stood there clutching nervously at their swords. One ran for help, another even dropped to his knees, bowing to the boy, as if he was of the highest caste. "I was only trying to clean the blood," the boy cried. "Take it back." But his fingers would not unclench from the hilt. He tried to pry them off with his other hand, but they wouldn't budge. He managed to get to his feet. The tip of the sword was dragging along the floor and slicing through the stone. "I'm sorry." He lifted the sword so it would do no more harm. "I'll fix that, I promise." The boy turned in a circle and found that he was surrounded by warriors. Each one took a fearful step back as the blade pointed at him. Even in the hands of a child, there was no mistaking how incredibly lethal the sword was. "Why have I been awakened?" It was the woman, the angry one all of the warriors deferred to, the one who was in charge, the one who was going to have him whipped to death in the dungeons for his insolence. Then she was staring right through the boy at the sword he was waving about, and her expression changed from icy rage to shock. "The blood scrubber picked up the ancestor blade," one of the guards explained. "As if Angruvedel would choose a casteless." She began to laugh, only it was a bitter, mirthless sound. "Give it a moment and he'll slice his own throat." "He's been holding it for several minutes, milady. It doesn't appear to be turning on him." "Well, oceans." "This is impossible," one of the guards stammered. "Only the best warrior may take up this sword. This has never happened before." "As far as anyone knows, it isn't happening now." The woman appeared to be deep in thought. She frowned at the boy. "Do not speak a word about this to anyone. Summon my advisors." "Are you comfortable, child?" the woman asked him. The boy nodded. The lady of the great house didn't seem so angry with him now. "Good. Drink up." They'd given him some cushions to sit on and a cup of wine. He was still scared, but something in the drink had made him very sleepy. The sword had finally allowed his fingers to release it, so it was resting at his side. Though he wished they would, no one had tried to take the sword from him yet. "I'm sorry I took it." He was having a hard time speaking. It was like his tongue was too big for his mouth. "You can have your sword back." "I'm afraid it doesn't work that way, child. An ancestor blade cannot simply be given or taken." A few other members of the first caste had joined them, and then they'd gone to a smaller, more private room. It was covered in silks, softer than anything he'd ever felt before, and the air was filled with perfumes that made his face itch. The woman in charge was named Medea, because that's what the other important whole men called her, except for the youngest one who kept calling her Mother. The young man was pacing back and forth nervously, while the others sat. The boy was very sleepy, but he could tell that the young man was very upset, even more so than the others, or maybe he wasn't good at hiding it yet. "You should have had the guards execute the little fish-eater on the spot." "That would have been foolish, Harter," one of the old men in robes stated. He had white hair and a bushy beard. Your mother was wise to proceed cautiously. What's done is done. And Gruvadal chose this castless for some unknowable reason. He is the bearer now, and one does not simply execute a bearer. Speaking of which, the young man stopped his pacing long enough to look the boy over. Are we in danger? What's to stop it from slaughtering us all? Besides the fact that he's probably only 5 or 6 years old and the sword is bigger than he is? Medea snorted. Calm yourself. The boy is no danger. His drink is laced with a bit of the sleeping poppy. I'm surprised he's still awake at all. You should have just poisoned it and saved us all the trouble, Harter complained. That would be unwise, the old man said. The sword has spoken. If we went against its wishes, and Gruvadal might construe that as an act of treachery. To murder the bearer of an ancestor blade is a terrible dishonor against a house. Traditionally, the only way to remove a bearer is through a proper duel, and he is far too young to legally enter into a duel. Damn it, Chavans! The judges don't have to know, Harter shouted. I'm not worried about what the judges think. I'm worried about what the sword thinks. Why do you think there are so few of them left? There were once hundreds of black steel weapons, and now there are only a score, if that many. If the blade feels its house is no longer worthy of protection, then it will perish. The surest way to prove we are unworthy is by murdering its bearer. A duel isn't murder under the law. Neither is falling asleep in the bath, and this stinky little creature could certainly use a bath. No one has ever accused an ancestor blade of having nuance, Harter. If we murder the bearer, no matter how clean we keep our hands, the sword might shatter. So what? Harter waved his hand dismissively. Killing the brat is worth the risk. Even if it breaks, it isn't like Father used that sword in decades. There hasn't been a demon washed up on our shores in my lifetime. Vidal is the strongest of the great houses. We don't need to rely on some superstitious artifact when we're this well positioned in the capital. It isn't just the blade itself, but what the blade symbolizes, Chavans argued. Losing our house's sword will make us appear weak, and our allies in the courts will turn on us. I'd rather not have an ancestor blade at all than bear the scorn of having it carried about by a castless scum. Harter kicked a pillow for emphasis. On that point, we are in agreement, Chavans said. However we proceed, no one can ever know of this shame. The sleeping poppy was making it hard for the boy to keep his eyes open, and there was a pleasant humming in his ear. While Chavans and Harter continued their debate, Medea was absently studying the boy. He'd seen that expression before on the face of a butcher about to take apart a hog, only he found that he was too tired to care. Harter had gone back to pacing. Worst-case scenario, we kill the castless, the sword shatters, and then we give the shards to Kuhl's wizards to play with. I know they're constantly raiding the treasury to buy black steel fragments and demon parts, enough as it is. If you believe that's the worst that can happen, then you lack the imagination necessary to someday rule this house, Chavans replied. If this scandal were ever brought to light, it would ruin us. We would become the laughingstock of the council. Our warriors would revolt before they would follow a non-person into battle. The capital would send the protectors to execute us all. Enough, both of you, Medea said. Chavans and Harter closed their mouths. She looked over her shoulder at the last person in the room. This man had not spoken this entire time. He was so quiet and unassuming that the boy had nearly forgotten he was there. The boy must go, but we can't jeopardize the sword, What do you think, Kuhl?" The boy shivered. It was a name that was spoken of only with fear and superstition among the casteless of House Vidal. From the stories, he'd expected a fire-breathing giant dressed in demon hide, raven feathers, and baby skulls. But Kuhl just seemed like a small, quiet, soft-spoken type. If he'd been casteless, he would have been too frail to work, and would have been sent to the pleasure houses to be abused for the whole men's amusement. But everything was different when you could work magic. "Kuhl?" The terrifying wizard was cleaning beneath his fingernails with a talon that had been cut off a bird of prey. "Send him to the Protector?" He answered absently. "What?" That seemed to alarm Harter. "Are you mad? What would that bunch of fanatics want with it? How does that solve—" Medea held up her hand, and the air immediately fell silent. "Continue." "The answer to our conundrum lies with history."
That was another entry in the complete audiobook serialization of Son of the Black Sword by Larry Correia. And that's it for the podcast, thanks to Audible.com and to podcast theme composer Ruth Judkowitz. And the lone call of an infected zombie wolf lamenting that zombie wolves are driven to eat fruits and vegetables, yuck. But also happy that one of the other powers it has been granted is the ability to read John Ringo novels with its eerie new intelligence. As well as thanks, praise, and kudos of those of us who remain after the deluge and purgation of life to Mike Massa, co-author with John Ringo of The Valley of Shadows. Please join us next time here at the hammering heart of science fiction and fantasy, and keep reaching for the stars.